At my daughter-in-law's birthday dinner, she raised her glass and announced I'd sell my home move-in with them and serve their family every day. My son stayed silent. No one objected. I asked 2 questions, then smiled. By morning, every bit of their access was gone. And that night, they called me 42 times, but I didn't answer. The restaurant in the heart of Savannah was elegant, all white linen and low candlelight, but the atmosphere at our table felt heavy. We were there to celebrate my daughter-in-law Natalie's 30th birthday. My son Julian was glued to his phone, while Natalie held court with her parents, sketching out grand visions for their future. I sat at the edge of the conversation, the quiet observer. I'm 64 years old, a widow who manages her own estate and the historic brownstone I've called home for decades. I don't need a roadmap for my life, but Natalie clearly felt otherwise that night. Between the main course and dessert, she tapped her wine glass with a spoon. She gave me one of those smiles that never quite reaches the eyes. "We've made a decision," she announced, looking more at her parents than at me. "Since Julian and I are planning to move into a much larger estate in the suburbs, we figured out how to make it work. Renee, we think it's time for you to sell the brownstone. The equity will go toward our down payment, and in exchange, you'll have a room there. Of course, we'd expect you to handle the housekeeping and host our guests while we're at the office." A sharp silence followed. Julian still wouldn't look at me. Natalie pressed on. "In our family, it's a tradition for the older generation to support the younger ones by holding down the fort. You'll be our household manager." I didn't feel anger, just a sudden crystal-clear coldness. I looked Natalie dead in the eye. "That's an interesting proposal," I said calmly. "Tell me, is this a request for help or a prerequisite for our future relationship?" Natalie blinked, caught off guard. "It's an expectation of a loyal family member, Renee." I took a slow sip of my wine, set the glass down with precision, and smiled. In that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. The dinner was over for me, but my plan was just beginning. I thanked them politely for the invitation and walked out of the restaurant before the cake even hit the table. In my head, I was already moving money. The drive home was quiet. I didn't even turn on the radio. Back in my kitchen, I brewed a cup of tea and sat at the heavy oak table my husband and I had bought 30 years ago. I'm not a woman of big speeches or emotional outbursts. I'm a woman of facts and figures. Julian had always been a good kid, but his silence at the restaurant spoke louder than any argument. He was willing to sell my independence to buy his own comfort. The next morning, I didn't call Julian. I didn't call anyone. I went straight to my home office and pulled the file on my properties. 2 months ago, I'd given Julian power of attorney over one of my savings accounts, just a precaution in case something happened to me. That was my first mistake. I logged online and revoked that access with 3 clicks. It felt remarkably good. Next, I looked at the automatic transfer I used to help Julian with the lease on his luxury SUV. I'd called it a helping hand. Now I saw it as dead weight. I canceled the payment. My money is my fortress, and I wasn't going to let Natalie take it apart stone by stone to build her castle. I knew it wouldn't take long for them to realize the wind had shifted. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was Julian. I let it ring. I wasn't ready for excuses or for him to downplay Natalie's power move. Instead, I grabbed my shears and went out to the garden to prune the roses. I watched the neighbors and enjoyed the structure of my own life. If they wanted me as a servant, they were about to find out exactly how much my services cost. I packed a small bag for a weekend getaway. I needed space, but more importantly, I needed a clean break. 2 days later, Julian showed up at my door. He looked exhausted. "Mom, why aren't you answering? Natalie's offended because you ditched her birthday dinner like that." I let him in. but I didn't offer him coffee. That was the first boundary. Usually I'd have a cake or at least some cookies ready. Today, the kitchen was cold. "I've been busy, Julian, getting my affairs in order," I said simply. He sat at the kitchen table, looking lost. "Natalie didn't mean anything bad by the house talk. She just wants us to be together. And about the bank. My dealer called. The car payment didn't go through." I looked at him, my expression unreadable. "That's correct. I've decided that my financial support for your lifestyle ends the moment that lifestyle treats my personal freedom as a bargaining chip." Julian stammered, talking about misunderstandings. He mentioned that Natalie was already picking out paint for my room in the new house. I cut him off gently. "There won't be a room for me, Julian. And there won't be a sale of this house. If you want a mansion, you'll have to buy it with your own money." His face went pale. It hit me. Then he had already factored my home's value into their budget. "But we've already put in a verbal offer on the place in Berwick," he whispered. "Natalie promised her parents we'd host their anniversary party there." I smiled. "Then Natalie should probably learn how to roast a turkey. I won't be the catering staff for her social circle." Julian left earlier than usual. He didn't look angry. He looked shocked. He had severely underestimated quiet Renee. Once he was gone, I called a locksmith and changed the deadbolts. Not because I didn't trust him with a key, but because I wanted full control over my own space. It was a symbolic act. For the first time in years, I felt wide awake. By the end of the week, I got a text from Natalie's mother, Beverly. She suggested a clearing of the air over lunch. I knew what that meant. In her world, I was the stubborn old woman blocking the progress of a power couple. I agreed, but I didn't invite her over. We met at a neutral bistro downtown. I showed up 5 minutes late on purpose. Beverly didn't waste time. "Renee, we have to think about the kids' future. Natalie is devastated. She feels rejected. Buying a home is a massive undertaking, and as parents, we have to stand together." I stirred my black coffee. Standing together means mutual respect, Beverly. It doesn't mean liquidating my assets and planning my retirement as a live-in maid. Beverly let out a forced, sharp laugh. Oh, that was just a figure of speech. "She wants to integrate you into their lives." I placed my hand flat on the table. Figures of speech don't pay mortgages. If Natalie saw my home as her down payment, she did her math wrong. I am keeping my property. This conversation is over. I dropped a 20 on the table for my coffee and stood up. I saw Beverly reaching for her phone before I'd even cleared the door. The pressure on Julian was about to skyrocket. Natalie would make him feel every bit of that crumbling dream. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I walked into a bookstore and bought a travel guide for Tuscany. I suddenly had the urge to spend the fall in Italy on my own dime, by my own rules. That night, Julian left 3 voicemails. He sounded desperate. He said Natalie was threatening to call off their vow renewal next year if I didn't behave reasonably. I deleted the messages. Reason is a very flexible word. I slept better that night than I had in a decade. The following week, I started a thorough inventory, not just of my finances, but of my time. I had spent the last 2 years helping Julian and Natalie with every move, every renovation, and every party. I had stayed silent when Natalie criticized my decor or gave me unsolicited advice on how to dress more modern. That was over. I started reclaiming my house. The room that used to be Julian's old bedroom, which he'd been using as a free storage unit for his winter tires and old tax files, was the first to go. I called a junk removal service. Anything of his that hadn't been touched in a year was either tossed or boxed up and dropped on his doorstep. I was making space for a new hobby I wanted to paint again. When Julian found the boxes at his apartment, he called me furious. "Mom, what is this?" "This is my stuff," I answered calmly. "It's my room, Julian. You don't live here, and I am not your free warehouse. You can keep the stuff or lose it. Your choice." He hung up on me. It was the first time he'd been that disrespectful, but I barely felt a sting. I realized my perspective was shifting. I wasn't grandma on call or the ATM in the background. I was Renee, a woman of means and a clear mind. I invited an old friend over whom I'd neglected because I was always making myself available for Julian. We laughed all night, and she told me, "Renee, you look 10 years younger." That night, I got the first text from Natalie. It was short and venomous. "You're destroying our future out of pure ego. We won't forget this." I didn't reply. Silence is the loudest answer you can give to entitlement. Without my monthly checks and the promise of the house sale, Natalie and Julian's house of cards began to wobble. Julian made a good living, but they lived way beyond their means. The designer vacations, the leased cars, the $200 brunches, it was all built on sand. I knew from the records that they had almost no savings. Buying that estate in Berwick was flat out impossible without me. Natalie tried a new tactic. She started texting me photos of her friends' kids, adding captions like, "This could have been us if we had a real home for a family." It was a clumsy attempt to weaponize my maternal instincts, but I had already seen the truth if I gave in. Now I'd spend the rest of my life in a guest suite, washing the laundry of a woman who despised me. I went to my bank and consulted an advisor on how to set up my capital, so it provided a lifelong annuity that no one else could touch. The advisor was impressed by my clarity. "Most people your age are worried about how much they can leave behind," he said. I replied, "I'll happily leave behind whatever is left, but I refuse to spend my living years begging for my own bread." On Wednesday, I ran into Julian at the grocery store. He avoided my eyes. He looked haggard, wearing a suit that looked like it needed a dry cleaner he couldn't afford. I felt a brief flash of pity, but then I remembered his silence at that dinner. He could have said, "Natalie, my mother isn't a servant." He didn't. He made his choice, and I made mine. I bought the most expensive set of oil paints in the store, a gift to myself. I felt truly independent for the first time in my life. On a rainy Tuesday evening, they both showed up at my door, Julian and Natalie. They looked like they were on a mission. I let them into the foyer, but didn't offer them a seat. "We're giving you one last chance." "Renee," Natalie started, skipping the pleasantries. "Either you sign the intent to sell agreement for this house, or we're cutting ties. You won't see any grandkids if we have them." There it was, the ultimate threat. Julian stared at his shoes, silent as ever. I looked at him. "Julian, is this your stance too?" He hesitated, then gave a weak nod. "We have to think about our future, Mom." I took a deep breath. It hurt, but it was a clean pain. The masks were finally off. "I understand," I said softly. "In that case, my answer is no. I'm not signing anything. And if you want to cut ties because I won't sacrifice my life for yours, then that's your decision, not mine." Natalie snorted. "You're going to die alone in this house surrounded by your money." I smiled at her. "I'd rather be alone and in control than in your house being humiliated." I opened the front door. "I believe everything has been said. Please leave." Natalie stormed out, and Julian followed her with slumped shoulders. As the door clicked shut, I felt an incredible sense of relief. The threat had been made, and the world hadn't ended. I was still here. My home was still mine, and my dignity was intact. I went into my studio and started priming a canvas. White on white. A fresh start. For the next 2 weeks, there was total radio silence. It was strangely quiet, but not lonely. I enjoyed not staring at the phone or wondering what Natalie was whispering about me. I met up with former colleagues, visited galleries, and painted. My first piece was finished an abstract of a storm at sea. It was wild and powerful. But then the calls started. It began on a Friday night. First Julian, then Natalie, then Julian again. I didn't pick up. Then Beverly called. I blocked her number immediately. They tried the landline, WhatsApp, everything. I turned my phone off and put it in a drawer. I knew what had happened. The deadline for their house contract had passed, or the bank had officially denied the loan. I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine watching the birds and thinking about how many women my age fall into the trap Natalie set. They do it out of love for their children, but they end up losing both their money and their children's respect. I kept my money and the respect. Well, Julian would have to find that on his own. In the middle of the night, I checked my phone. 42 missed calls. A record. It wasn't an expression of love. It was an expression of panic. They needed the signature of the simple old woman they had treated so condescendingly. I cleared the call log. I didn't need proof of their greed. I already knew it by heart. I felt safe within my walls. This house was more than brick and mortar. It was my freedom. The next morning, I headed to the airport. My flight to Florence left at 9. Florence was magnificent. The warmth, the light, the art. I spent my days in the Uffizi and my evenings in tiny trattorias. I didn't talk about my family to anyone. I was just a traveler, a woman enjoying her life. My phone stayed in the hotel safe most of the time. When I did turn it on, I saw the flood of messages, but I didn't even read them. I deleted them unopened. One text from Julian caught my eye before I swiped it away. "Mom, please, we're losing everything." I thought about that for a moment. They weren't losing everything. They were just losing a lifestyle they could never afford. They still had their jobs, their health, and each other. If their relationship couldn't survive that, it wasn't worth much to begin with. I didn't feel pity anymore, just a deep, quiet distance. In a gallery near the Ponte Vecchio, I saw a painting that mirrored my life. A woman standing alone on a cliff, looking at the horizon. She didn't look sad. She looked determined. I bought it and had it shipped to Savannah. I wanted it to remind me that it's never too late to say no. I realized I'd actually been hurting Julian for years by enabling him. I'd made him soft and given Natalie the space to dominate him. My no was the best thing I could have done for him. He needed to learn how to be a man who stands by his own choices without his mother's safety net. When I flew back after 10 days, I felt like a new person. I was ready for the final chapter. When I got back to the brownstone, the air felt fresh. I found a letter from Julian in my mailbox. It wasn't an emotional blackmail note. It was a handwritten letter. He told me that he and Natalie had split up. The stress over the house and the money had exposed cracks that had been there for a long time. He was living in a small studio apartment and starting over. He didn't ask for money. He asked for a talk whenever I was ready. I waited 3 days before calling him. We met in a park, not at my house. I wanted to keep my boundaries. He looked terrible, but he seemed more honest than I'd seen him in years. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. I was weak. I wanted to please her, and I forgot who actually had my back all these years. I just nodded. "Apology accepted, Julian. But things are going to be different." I laid out my new rules. No more monthly allowances. No interference in my life. And my home remains my fortress. If he wanted to see me, it would be as a son, not as a solicitor. He accepted it. It wasn't a movie ending with tears and hugs, but it was a real beginning. A foundation of truth instead of greed. I never saw Natalie again. I heard she's looking for a new project with a bigger inheritance. I wish her luck she'll need it because there are more and more women like me every day. Women who know the value of their own work and their own lives. My painting from Florence hangs in my living room now. Every time I look at it, I think of those 42 missed calls. I kept a screenshot of them in a folder on my phone, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. On that night in the restaurant, I chose myself, and it was the best decision I ever made. I picked up my brush and started a new piece. The colors were bright, clear, and full of light. Sometimes it isn't an argument that changes everything. It's the moment you walk away and don't look back. Some boundaries don't need explaining. The moment you stop allowing them, everything changes.